So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Anika.
I'm just really excited to see everyone here this evening, where I can just talk from my heart about the book and the work that went into it. But let me just, in case anyone is new to hearing from me at all, I just want to give you a little background. I came into classical education from my mom and dad. They started a classical Christian school in a predominantly Black neighborhood in PG County, and it ran for 10 years. They lured me away from the public school system. And I was first their performing arts teacher, and I ended up becoming the great books teacher until the school closed for like the last 6 years of the school's existence. And that was, all of it was an accident. I didn't intend, this was not a lifelong ambition of mine. My first love has been the performing arts. I have a master's in music and a master's in theater education from Howard University and NYU. But in the course of finishing all my graduate work, my parents started this school, and I was going to go in and just revolutionize their performing arts program. And I happened to just walk down the hall one day and saw a great books class, and the students were struggling to engage with the literature. And I had this idea of, oh, we can use music and drama to help them to connect. And which an example of that would be, we read a passage of something, and the next day they can come and bring a song in that they feel reminds them of it, or we would do an in-class dramatization or some type of creative drama around the piece. But in order to create these activities, I had to begin to read the literature myself, and I ended up actually preparing lessons that were beyond drama. It involved reading and discussing and writing. And before long, the teacher, I was supposed to be assisting a teacher, she realized how much I was loving it and decided to go back to elementary, because she had come up from elementary, to teach. And I took over the Great Books class, and I took a major detour. Like, my life literally just was going one way and just went that way. And I have not looked back since. And I have even felt crazy about this detour. I recognize even today, even with the classical education renewal movement going on, Alex and I were just talking about how we all are still a minority. I'm definitely a minority in my community with this with this interest. So it's a very lonely path. And I sometimes have to ask myself, why are you doing this again? But I'm hoping that today's conversation that I have with you will reveal why I feel this is so important, even to the point where I am willing to sacrifice everything to teach this, to share this, to write about this, to be an advocate for this. To me, it is life and death, not physically, but academically, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, to our young people, to our society. I believe it's that important. And it is not something I'm able to walk away from, because I recognize just how critical this is. So my thinking is, if I share this with just anyone, maybe they'll take it back to their community, to their school, to their neighborhoods, to their churches, to their people, and share these thoughts. And the biggest thing that I see with this, that I began to see as I worked with the students at my parents' school, is not just the potential of classical learning to broaden worldviews, to exercise the skills of critical thinking and speaking and writing. But I began to notice that walls began to go down, especially these racial walls. I noticed it first within myself when I was a student at St. John's. And when I came to St. John's, I was the only Black person there in most of my classes, many times. And I had a lot of anxiety about that, because I had attended some other universities that it was just sometimes a very hostile environment for me. And so I came into St. John's expecting to have those experiences. So I came up with my guards up, and I came in ready to just have to deal with whatever I was going to have to deal with. And I didn't have that. I'm not saying everything was always perfect, but it was a very different experience. And by that, I mean, when I sat around that Johnny table to talk about these texts, I began to feel my heart soften. And I began to feel walls come down. And I began to feel connections with those who sat around the table with me, simply as we discussed this literature that has been shared by all of our ancestors for centuries. And so that was my experience first, right? That was my experience first. Then as I began to teach it to the students at my parents' school, I began to observe these same things happen in my students' lives. They became very open-minded. They became, their hearts began to soften. They began to want to talk and communicate and build bridges to those outside of themselves. Just things began to change. Their sense of self began to change. They no longer saw themselves as just a Black person in an oppressed society. They kind of began to transcend that. So I'm talking about myself, I'm talking about what I saw in my students, and then finally, this is when I really knew that I had to focus on this. When I discovered Frederick Douglass, and he could say that he had the same experience, which then began to lead me to look around and just notice that many people who read these texts have the same experience. Now, we know many people have used these texts wrong. They've used them to promote a certain ideology that is not healthy for society at all. We know that, I'm not denying that. But there are many of us, there's a community of us that have, through the centuries, come around these texts and had a very different experience around them. And that's what I want to talk to you about. That's what I've written about in the book, what Dr. Parham has written about in the book. This is what I want to talk to you about today. And I'm going to focus a lot on Anna Julia Cooper as we talk about this notion of how do classics unify, or why classics unifies, because I feel she has some things to say about this topic. But before I go, I want you to first imagine this woman I've written about, and I still feel like I didn't say enough. I ran out of time. There was so much more I wanted to say. She herself was an enslaved woman. She understood oppression much better than I do. Like, my father is in his 80s. And there are times when I become this activist, you know, and I'm talking about what's going on in society. And my dad will say, you haven't seen oppression. I grew up in Jim Crow, Arkansas. You haven't seen anything yet. So I'm gonna need you to sit down somewhere. But, you know, Anna Julia Cooper, she was an enslaved woman, a girl. She was in slavery until she was 10 years old at emancipation. She never escaped to freedom. It is said that she was the daughter of her master and that her mother was most likely his mistress. That was her other role on the plantation. And she kind of hints to this background and how it made her feel, how it made her mother feel, and even said that her father was not worth anything. She had no love for him whatsoever. So she understood, if anyone, she should be the one to want to reject this, right? But she didn't. And I'm really fascinated by that. I'm really fascinated that Frederick Douglass and others didn't reject this literature. Why? Because of this power it has to connect us to each other, the way it talks about these common human experiences and ways of thinking. So I want to show you something first. So I want to just give you, just for you to really imagine. So this is Anna Julia Cooper's house. I went there yesterday. I'm just kind of thinking about her in preparation, reflecting on the book. This is a mansion basically in DC. It was to be considered a mini mansion in Washington, DC. It's very close to Howard University. Someone lives there now, but over here to the side, you can see the plaque. Anna Julia Cooper's name is on there. This was her house. Imagine a woman who was born into slavery, was freed at 10 years old through emancipation, coming up from that, and at 106 years old, died in this home, died as a owning this house. And her whole work, many people think her whole work was feminism, which it was not. Her whole work was providing a classical and Christian education to the African-American community. And through that work, this once enslaved person found herself living here until she died. That is the power. And she has these beautiful quotes. You have to go, you can go walk past the house. It's, I think 1800 Vermont Avenue. I'll put the address in if you ever come to DC. I just stood there and was just like, she lived here. Oh my gosh, I'm here. I could not believe it. But listen to this quote. We're going to work through this quote that she says, which really connects to this topic of how classics unifies. And she says, I'm going to break it up because it's a lot. And it's from her book. Well, the book is called The Voice of Anna Julia Cooper. You can get it on Amazon. And it includes her book, A Voice from the South, as well as letters and poems and other writings, and a really thorough biography. So this is like, I have 2 copies because my other one's about to fall apart. But she says this. Let me see if I can start. We must, whatever else we do, insist on those studies which by the consensus of educators are calculated to train our people to think, which will give them the power of appreciation and make them righteous. In a word, we are building men and women, not chemists or farmers or cooks or soldiers, but human beings ready to serve the body politic in whatever avocation their talent is needed. Okay, I'm gonna skip down a little bit, and then she goes on to say, the first for all men, this is our connecting here, whether for white men, red men, yellow men, or black men, whether for rich men or poor men, high or low, the aim of education for the human soul is to train aright, to give power and right direction to the intellect, the sensibilities, and the will. Certain studies, certain courses, certain exercises have been tested, tried, accepted by the experience of centuries in the steady progress of humanity. So let's stop right there. So I love her. She is really, truly my example because she's not talking about trying to make the Black community better than. She's not in a competition. She's very intentional about saying, this is for all of us. This type of education is what will draw us all together. Now, one thing we might want to ask ourselves is, how did this once enslaved woman come to this place of valuing classical education as a way, the best way to educate our people and the best way to connect us to American society? And I think a lot of it has to do, surprisingly, in my research, it goes way back to ancient Africa. And I want you to go with me here. So the study of classics has been around for centuries, almost since the beginning of time. In ancient Rome, there was an enslaved man by the name of Terence the African. He was brought probably from Ethiopia. We don't know a lot about him, but we can glean a lot about him from his writings. And he was brought into Rome, and his master recognized he was very intelligent. Now, I'm always leery when people say that, when writings say that, as if there's a shock that an African would be intelligent. And one thing I like to tell people is that the African people who came into Western society already had an intellectual tradition. They weren't just kind of wild animals sitting there with an empty mind until they were enslaved or until they were brought into Western society. They already had their own intellectual tradition. What they didn't have was the ability to speak the language of the West, whether it be Latin or English or what have you. And so many, when they came in, because they were already curious, they were already engaged in this dialogue about the literacy of their people, they came into Western society still wanting to engage in that. And so Terence's master noticed this about him and then began to give him the language, almost as if I were to go live in a foreign country and I had a tutor to teach me. And so I could learn that language. His master did that for him. And in a very short time, Terence the African learned Greek and Latin. And from that, he began to write these beautiful, very entertaining plays. We have about 6 that we've preserved, but we believe there's more that were destroyed, but there's 6 have been preserved. My favorite is the Girl from Andros. Now, I'm going somewhere with this so you can understand how this connects to Anna Julia Cooper and how she came into classics. All right, so he becomes so popular as a playwright. Terence the African in ancient Rome ends up in the royal court of Rome. He is like, his benefactors, those who supported his plays and the production of his plays, were the same ones who defeated Hannibal. He was a part of the Scipionic Circle, which was a circle. Scipio created this kind of intellectual gathering of politicians, artists, educators, philosophers to talk about philosophy and culture and history and art. and society and politics. And Terence the African, who was once a slave, his master ended up freeing him as he became more popular, was a part of this intellectual engagement. Well, Terence dies in his late 20s, early 30s. And you would think, okay, that's the end of Terence. Yeah, we have his plays. But Terence's plays were written with such perfect Latin that his plays were used in early American schools. There's a letter that John Adams wrote to his son and he's telling his son, and you can look this up. For sake of time, I'm not going to pull it up, but John Adams tells his son, if you really want to learn how to speak Latin, you need to read the plays of Terence. And so Anna Julia Cooper was living in a space where this study of classics and ancient writers was a part of the culture that she was in. In fact, when she was freed and she went to St. Augustine's College, that college, they built it on the former plantation that she was raised up on. So she was just kind of in this space of intellectual engagement. And they say she may have been literate as she came out of slavery. And so she went on to St. Augustine's College, where classical learning was the only education. There wasn't choices. There weren't different types of philosophies of education. Everyone was educated classically. And Black people, before slavery ended, because that's the only type of education they knew, they were kind of developing a Black market of classical education for their community. They were sneaking it back into their slave quarters and sharing it with each other. And so Anna Julia Cooper comes out of that. She probably read Terence. Phyllis Wheatley talks about it in her poetry. Phyllis Wheatley, who comes a little bit before Anna Julia Cooper, talked about reading the plays of Terence and how him being an African educated classically inspired her as an African becoming educated classically. And so this was just a part of the culture. Not just white people were embracing classical learning. My ancestors were. And so this is a common ground. I get excited when I think about that. When I read that letter from John Adams to his son, you've got to read the plays of Terence. You've got to read the plays of an ancient African author. And so from the beginning, we have been connecting through this literature. And that's why Anna Julia Cooper was able to say that. Now, I'm going to read another part of this quote. Watch this. So going down a little bit, she says, teachers from Aristotle to the present have sifted and analyzed the various branches of learning to get at their relative worth as educative factors. The results of their experiments and analysis are not hidden in dark places. Like the story I'm telling you about what we need to, how we should be educated is not anything that's hidden. They are universally, I love that word, universally. This is again, that unifying word, universally. They are universally accepted by teachers and thinkers as a reasonable and proper basis for the education, and she doesn't say of Black people. She says, this is what's appropriate for the education of mankind. And she's able to, and we can prove, we can look through history and see this is what we share together, this type of education. And that type of education and sharing that education is actually what unifies us, what did unify us as we continue to fight for this country to be what it's supposed to be. You know, the country is called the United States. What has united us here? What definitely, racism definitely hasn't, slavery definitely didn't. Believing that one race is superior to another definitely didn't. Elitism definitely did not unify. We know that faith played a part in unifying us. We know the Bible and Christianity played a part in unifying us as we shared this faith in Jesus Christ. But another thing that unified us that you can see pervasively over and over is this type of education. Now, some may listen to me and say, is this an elitism? Are you saying that only learning about the West is the only answer? Is everything okay? Let me see. I'm seeing chat. Okay. And so it's not just those things that unify us, but what we can look at, where was the unity? Was there ever unity in American history? Yes, there was. And I'm not ignoring other stories, but there's a verse that says that we want to think on things that are good and lovely and true and just, of good report. And the good report here is that there is a story where we were unified around this common literacy. And this common literacy that Anna Julia Cooper was a proponent of is what was very instrumental in us tearing down the racism, tearing down the Jim Crow laws. It was a battle that we fought together, unified through this common literacy that we find in classic literature. I'm gonna read another part. I'm almost done because I know there's some questions. It says, let's see, hold on. Here we go. The only way to meet those skeptics who still ask with half a sneer, what is the use of this classical education or that study for the Negro, is with the query, this is the question, she said, we should ask those who look down on this type of education. Is it good for men? Are we not human beings? And Sojourner Truth says, ain't I a woman? Yes. Has it been selected for curricula universally? And has it stood the test for the discipline it gives in the direction of thought power, power of appreciation, power of willing the right? These are the things we need. I love, this is from her, what I'm reading to you is from her essay called On Education. And it's a really powerful essay because she's talking on the one hand about the best education for African-American people, but she's also talking about the right kind of education that unifies, which would be classical education. The final thing I want to say to you is that she really came to feel strongly about this as she began to be caught up in this argument between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Du Bois, again, a big supporter of classical education. Booker T. Washington feeling like classical education is unnecessary. We need to teach them trades so they can get a job and be contributors to society. And Anna Julia Cooper has one more thing that she had to say to that. And she says this: the Negro has had manual education throughout his experience as an enslaved person. For 250 years, he was practically the only laborer in the American market. His training was whatever his teachers decreed it should be. His skill represented the best teaching of the section in which he found himself. If he did not reckon a knowledge of machinery among his accomplishments, it must be admitted that machinery was very tardily introduced into the Southland. But his methods as a farmer, as a mechanic, as a nurse, as a domestic, were the result of the best teaching the peculiar institution of enslavement offered him. What was the lack? And that's when she goes right into, we don't need that type of manual education. We've done that for hundreds of years. Let's do something different. Let's be educated like those who founded this so we can share in this conversation. Let's be educated like those who founded this country, who wrote our Constitution, who wrote our Declaration of Independence, not to forget our heritage, not to forget what we've gone through as a people, not to forget our pain. But as James Baldwin says, I will never be fit to live in Africa, James Baldwin says. So I must find my heritage here, and as he says, in these white centuries. But my ancestors helped me find my heritage in these white centuries. As I read Anna Julia Cooper and Frederick Douglass and Martha King and Du Bois and even all the way up to Angela Davis, even Barack Obama, anyone who looks like me, who has played a major part in the progress of our country, was through having this common literacy that they could go in and share together in the effort to bring about the common good of the human beings that live here. This is how classics unifies us. And they used it. My ancestors used it as a mighty weapon, as a tool to join in and be a participant in our democracy. So that's just a little bit of what I'm hoping you'll come to understand from my section of the book on Anna Julia Cooper, which is a practical look at what Angel Parham talks about and how we as teachers can look at Anna Julia Cooper as an example for how to bring classical education to diverse communities so they can see themselves in the literature. In closing, I met a woman recently who is from Haiti, and she just started working at a classical school in Houston. And she came to me after hearing me speak. She said, I'm so thankful that you spoke. One of my biggest struggles is I'm not African-American, I'm Haitian. I can't really connect with here. How does classical education connect? I see how it connects to the African-American heritage. I understand that, and I know that's my role, but I don't see how it connects to my heritage. And I said, oh my goodness, I love this conversation. I said, Toussaint, the one who made it possible for Haiti to be free from slavery, loved classics. You can see it in his letters, his writing about Epictetus, who wrote that, they call his, like, the manual, I think it's called, where he talks, or another name for it is How to Be Free. I said, that's your ancestor. And then another thing is the Haitian Revolution inspired my ancestors to stand up for their freedom. That was very and see, here I'm connecting with this woman around classics. She had educated her kids classically, but was trying to find this link. And here I am, an African-American woman born and raised in DC, connecting with a woman from Haiti around this body of knowledge that made its all its way into the Haitian Revolution. It unifies us. It connects us to each other. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anika. All right, so I'm sure there's questions. I've already got a few in here. So please go ahead and we'll do our question and answer time now. So any questions you've got, please use the Q&A function to type those out, and we will get to as many as we can. While you guys are doing that, I'd love to share a few links with you. One is a link to the webpage about Dr. Prather and Dr. Parham's new book titled The Black Intellectual Tradition. So I'm going to post that here in the chat. We've got a second link as well that I'm going to share. And this second link that I'm sending now is to Dr. Prather and Dr. Parham's Classical U course, also titled The Black Intellectual Tradition. So if you'd like to read or hear more from them, that's where to do it. Anika, can you see the questions that are coming in?
Yeah, I think I can see.
From
Okay,
Emily?
yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Awesome.
Okay, Emily says, I'm wondering if you have brought some of your ideas and your fresh perspective into the public school world, and if so, what your impression of the reception was. It has made its way into many charter schools. I don't know if you said this at the beginning, Alex, but I have recently taken a position at Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy as the director of high quality curriculum and instruction. Very long title, I'm still trying to learn it. And one of my roles is to kind of talk with different public school leaders about things, how to bring more content-rich curriculum into their schools. And it's my hope that I can be able to show people not to throw this out. I'm hoping that that message will get through, that I'm not opposed to contemporary literature, contemporary ways of gaining content knowledge, but we cannot turn our back on this ancient works because it is the seed of everything that we know. I hope that answered your question. Malika, I think, says, Dr. Prather, I would love to hear you speak a bit more about the idea of lament from the book. Yes, and then, okay, so let me see, I wish they could, they can't talk, can they? Can they talk? Can you all talk?
And I think I can. If you would like to,
or to explain, I want her to explain which part. Are you talking about how the country needs to go through this process of lament like, are you talking about us lamenting? Are you talking about, if you could just clarify the perspective, there's different perspectives that can come from that.
I just gave her permission to speak, so she
Okay.
should be able to.
And I hope I said your name right. Hello?
I don't know. Malika, if you would like to speak, you should be able to. But if not, that's totally okay as well.
And then I can, what I can do is try to answer the way I think you mean it, and you can let me know if I hit the nail on the head.
Sure.
Or if your mic is able to work at some point, feel free to interrupt me and just jump in. I feel that the wonderful thing I love about this story around classics is it makes us all lament. There are times where people have presented classics, which I'm not a supporter of, as if they want to erase this story around the Black connection to classics and only talk about the goodness, the beautiful, the virtuous. And I've heard people say that we don't need to talk about that. Can we just talk about what's beautiful, what's virtuous? But when I talk about how people like Anna Julia Cooper or Frederick Douglass or even Toussaint from the Haitian Revolution connected to this literature as a way to help them make it through. I don't know if you all can hear my dog on the side. Make it through their oppression. That brings us to all lament. We have to look that experience in the face as we learn how classics helped someone like Frederick Douglass come to a place to say, these books were a light to my darkness. He said, just when I thought I would forever be a slave, I got my hands on the Columbian Orator, which is a collection of classic texts. And so that's what I think. That's why I think the story is so important, because I feel like it provides a healthy way for all of us to lament without it being about, you did this to me, you did this to me, you did this to me. But as we all share our stories of how these books have inspired us and how we are all allowed to share those stories, then we are naturally and lovingly brought to a place of lament. And so that's the perspective Dr. Parham and myself have come through. If you read the book, you notice we're not hiding the Black experience. We're not denying that. We're not coming from a place of colorblindness or let's just forget the past and move on. We're saying these stories were instrumental in the civil rights movement. And this is why. These stories were instrumental in the abolitionist movement. And this is why. And that connects us. And also it makes us kind of embrace a heritage of watching each of our ancestors struggle through understanding these texts, struggle through allowing these texts to convict them like they did Abraham Lincoln, so that we fight for America to do better. So I don't know if that answered your question. Hope it did.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yay! It's Malika. It's very close. So thank you.
You're welcome.
It's Arabic, so sometimes translating it doesn't work so well.
Yes.
Yes, that is exactly what I was asking. Whenever I hit that spot, you talk about it in the pages like right around the 20s and 27 through 29-ish.
Yes.
And how important it is to lament so that we don't close ourselves off to not only the beauty, but the truth of what was happening and the human struggle that truly unifies us all, because we're not all perfect.
That's
and
it.
We're all struggling through together.
Yes. 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 This is why I love them, because I feel like it hit me that this was possible when it was my first semester at St. John's, and I was nervous, but I had just discovered Du Bois's writings on classical education. And Marilyn Iguera, who was a tutor at St. John's, had also read it. And we sat there on the lawn talking about Du Bois, but I was able to talk about my experience as a Black woman through talking about classic literature. That was so liberating for me. And so that moment made me realize what was possible, that we can have this conversation. We can have this very hard, scary conversation, painful conversation with these texts. And we're not making up some new way of doing things. Like, the story is there. It is a true story. It's documented. And we can talk about it and appreciate it, and yet talk about these topics that often can be very difficult to discuss.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. Another one, Rosamond. Hi, Rosamond. How can we inspire African Americans to enroll in classical schools? Whew. Why don't you let me know when you find out? No, I'm just playing. That's a challenge. It's a lot that's going to have to happen. And I believe that a lot of the schools and institutions that are inviting me to speak are exploring how that can be done. I know a big part of it is that if you are a classical school, I want to choose my words carefully so no one misunderstands my heart. First of all, let me say this, and I think you all know this. I'm not against the West. I'm a huge fan of the West, okay, and its contributions to humanity. But there is a way that we have to teach it so that we draw all people in to this goodness. And let me share with you first what not to do. We will not draw the Black community into these schools if they are made to feel like your story doesn't matter. We're not interested in hearing it, but you must only celebrate and honor the West's contributions to humanity. We can't come from that perspective if we'll ever be able to give this over to them. And that's something Anna Julia Cooper understood. We give it to them with the understanding that these books have inspired all of humanity, and a lot of diverse literature is also connected to the creation of a lot of these works, and the works themselves don't hide that. So if I'm reading many of the ancient historians, they will talk about Africa. They will talk about the Middle East. There's a very rich classic story in the Middle East. And so, and it's not hidden, but schools tend to skip over those and only talk about certain key points. But as we pull people of color into these schools, show them the color of in the classics, and then show them how diverse individuals or people groups have connected to classics. We've got to tell it that way. And I believe once we begin to make that a part of the very fabric of our school, as opposed to, it's Black History Month, let's talk about Martin Luther King who read classics. That's not going to draw the people in. It has to be part of the conversation. I visited a school last week where a part of their reading included ancient African texts, ancient Middle Eastern texts, ancient Asian texts, and of course, classics. And there was this whole dialogue showing how there were common themes in these different works. And it didn't take away from the body of the Western canon. It just merely spoke to how this canon over here has similar human themes as this canon over here. And so when we have that mindset, I think that will be one way that we draw it in, and to really keep your eyes open for people of color to join the work with you. That will draw people in. Tracy says, my knowledge of educational movements in African-American community is limited to my introductory teaching of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington's autobiographies. Was there a tendency toward or away from teaching classically in the early African-American institutions? And if the early schools were more classical, did it change along with the typical public school in the US as modern education moved away? That's away from classical education. So no. So Black people, there's a phrase I say oftentimes that today there is the belief that classical education was used to oppress Black people. But if in my research, I am discovering that the taking away of classical education from the Black community was the oppression. So Anna Julia Cooper, which is why I focused on her, she was in her 90s when, 80s and 90s, when she began to see classical education pulled away. Well, she's probably in her 60s. Yes, 50s and 60s. It started around that time for her, when she began to see the influence of Booker T. Washington's industrial education begin to infiltrate Black schools and eventually all schools. Like, we've all been plagued by this stuff. And she really fought that. And she ended up losing her job. They wanted her to stop teaching classically. She taught Latin. She did most of her classes in fluent Latin. She taught classically, true blue. And as Booker T. Washington's influence in the American Board of Education, they began to ask her to stop. And she was the principal of the M Street School. And they asked her to stop. She would not stop. She began to really push and advocate. Don't take this education from my people. Don't do this. You're gonna distance them from being able to have the knowledge base needed to participate in our democracy. They wouldn't listen. And the reason why there was this move to remove it is that a French friar, a priest, had come to tour American schools. And he happened to visit Anna Julia Cooper's school, the M Street School, where she was serving as principal at the time. And he was so amazed because all of those students had been classically educated that he wrote a report that was made public to the world where he talked about American schools. And in his report, he said Anna Julia Cooper's M Street School students were the smartest of all the schools he visited. Soon after that report came out, Booker T. Washington, in partnership with the American Board of Education, began to slowly take classical education out of Black public schools. And Anna Julia Cooper was caught up in that turmoil. It is what kind of divided her with other female activists, such as Mary Church Terrell. People began to really side. As Booker T. Washington became very much embraced by American leadership, there became a divide. And Anna Julia Cooper lost her job. That's when she decided to go get her PhD at the Sorbonne in France. That same French priest welcomed her to France and helped her get into the Sorbonne and supported her in that journey. And she never was a principal ever again. And then she saw desegregation, and there's a quote by her where she felt desegregation was going to hurt Black people, because with desegregation, Black people would no longer have control over how their people were educated. And as a result, Black teachers began to lose their jobs, especially those who refused to stop teaching classically. And white teachers and racist, those who were racist, began to control the education of Black people. And as a result, classical education was taken, and a more diluted form of education was replaced. But it replaced it. And then with desegregation, having to provide the same education to all people, they opted to, instead of giving everyone classical education, to give a more industrialized education so that everyone was just kind of equal and no one was better. It's really kind of a twisted story. I hope you can follow it. And so that's what happened. Now, this is not to say that Black people have not used classical education to be elitist. Du Bois was known to be elitist. Alain Locke was known to be elitist. This is not to say that Black people sometimes didn't get into this type of education and begin to take on a more Victorian look, forgetting their heritage. I'm not denying that. But there's a story that's a little bit more pervasive, and that is that Black people really wanted to be classically educated. Many of the Black Panthers were classically educated. Fighting for this type of education was also a part of the activism, because they knew it gave them access to the language, the literacy needed to fight injustice and oppression in a way that fit with American democracy. Laura says, what about primary students? How does the classical tradition help enroll all cultures and experiences for our littlest learners? I think one of the coolest things about it is if you start off with Aesop's fables, and then just teaching them inquiry-based instruction, teaching them how to have a conversation. I love the writings of Charlotte Mason. She doesn't call herself a classical educator, but I totally think she was. But she talks about teaching the little ones the art of narration, where instead of giving them just fill in the blank, reading to them this rich literature or this list of books called the good books. You can look it up online. If you put in a search, what are the list of good books? These are books that are good for reading to little people that prepare them for reading the canon. So the books of Laura Ingalls Wilder would be an example. Little Women would even be an example of a good book. Even some of C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia will be considered good books. These are just, and then even some of the folk tales and fairy tales and things like that. But these really complex storylines that little children can read and narrate back to you and ask questions and talk to you. So with the little people, you are just training them up and preparing them to partake of this great feast that they'll be able to participate in later on. Yes, and then even now, I kind of have mixed views sometimes, but there's also the author's last name is Lamb, Lamb, like a sheep lamb, and they've put together. I wish I could find that. A collection of Shakespeare stories that are written so well. Yes, Charles and Mary Lamb. They're written so well. Tales from Shakespeare. It's the best. It's the best I've ever seen, because the language is not so far away from the original text. It's just challenging enough, but yet simple enough for a young child. And I used to read those aloud to kindergartners when I was teaching kindergarten, and they wanted it every day after recess. Can you read us from Shakespeare? And they really got into it. So I think doing those types of things prepare them for reading that later and partaking later. Hope that's helpful. Tracy asks, do you think Booker T. Washington compromised in order to keep support? Because it sounded like in his early writings that his goal was to give his people the power of function in all ways independently of their white neighbors so that they were no longer dependent. Do you think he began emphasizing the trade aspect because it was more accepted, or was that always his emphasis and I've been misreading him? So I always tell people, Booker T. Washington makes me feel schizophrenic. I love the man and I can't stand the man. I think that he was scared. Here he was, a former slave who had become a very wealthy president of a college, was world renowned. He had death threats. There were even hitmen sent to kill him. I think he had seen a lot of violence and torture happen to his people. And I believe that his main goal was to keep his people alive and safe and self-sustaining. And I think that he felt that if I just tell them, the majority of them, just to do this until it kind of works itself out, this will be the better way. And so he began to notice that by teaching this, he made white people not so angry at him, at Black people. And I don't believe he had any evil intent. And Du Bois often spoke against what he was saying, but we must remember that Du Bois had never been a slave, had never lived in the Deep South, had never experienced having his life threatened on the level that Booker T. Washington had. Yes. So if you read, Rosamond, if you read Revolutionary Suicide by Huey P. Newton, the co-founder of the Black Panther, he talks about how Plato's Republic inspired him to start the Black Panther. Yeah. So that's Booker T. Washington's. I'm hoping I can not deliver people from being angry at him like I used to be. That's his story. So he's still very, very important, but he did kind of, he did definitely play a part in getting us off track. And you know, when slavery ended, there was a really aggressive move to establish early Black schools, and they were classically based. And Abraham Lincoln was really behind that effort. He appointed Oliver Howard, who was the founder of Howard University, to set up these schools, and most, if not all of them, were classically inspired. But then Abraham Lincoln died. He was murdered. And Andrew Johnson took his place. And Andrew Johnson ended the work of the Freedmen's Bureau. He ended the work that Abraham was doing to try to educate Black people to become a part of American society and democracy. That period of Reconstruction, for a brief time, Black people were starting to be elected officials. Like, we were moving. And Andrew Johnson ushered in Jim Crow. He took away the soldiers that protected Black people from the violence of those who wanted them to still be enslaved. And Andrew Johnson actually put us back. Like, he's the reason we're in the state we're in now. So I always say to people, we need to go back to what Abraham Lincoln was trying to do. Many of us don't even realize we're actually carrying on the work of a very racist president named Andrew Johnson. And we actually need to go back and complete the work that Abraham Lincoln was trying to do. As he evolved, he was not a perfect man. He had definite racist ideas about Black people, but at the time of his death, you can look at his speeches from his first inaugural address to his last inaugural address that he gave just a few days before he was murdered. and see that he was evolving. He was beginning to change. He just never lived long enough where we could see his full evolution. And part of that was he was putting things into place to help Black people coming out of slavery get acclimated to democracy and being a part of that. And a big part of that was establishing classical schools. Oh, wow. Oh my goodness, I will read it, Tracy. Thank you. Any more questions? Let me see, there's another one here. Yes, it is. It is. It is. Sarah, yes, you will hear about that French friar in that book. Okay, so then there's a whole other story I want to tell one day. I want to tell the story of the role the Catholic faith played in this story. Like, that's a whole nother, I don't know if there's any Catholics out there. If you are, just, give me a shout out. But I'm not Catholic, although I love the Catholic community. It's been very supportive of the work that I'm doing. There is that's a story, because you can look at some slave narratives and see this effort of Orthodox too, of the Catholic faith, monks, nuns, educating oppressed people classically, and those people becoming like abolitionists or some type of activists of some kind. So that's a very rich story. And so that story of the French friar with Anna Julia Cooper was very powerful to me. Alex, I'm working on it. The professor, the Catholic chaplain at Howard, and I have been having some conversations about this. How do we tell that story? Yes, yes, yes. Beautiful. I want to so bad. There's so many stories to tell. Like, one story what I've been talking to you about tonight, I want to talk about that a lot more. That's not in the Black intellectual tradition. I want to tell the story of the role the Catholic faith played in bringing classics to oppressed people and what role that played. It's just it's a few stories that kind of show also a pattern here. Like, I have this, I know we're running out of time, but really quickly, I can't prove it. I have been looking. I'm going to probably go to the Library of Congress and see if I can find anything. But Squanto was an enslaved man too. He was kidnapped from the Americas and sold into slavery, taken into Europe. And his freedom was purchased by monks. They educated him and set him free. And then he eventually was able to get on a boat and come back to his homeland, where he found his people had died. But that's why he could speak English when the Pilgrims got here. And so I believe, because of the kind of education that was going on in the Catholic churches at that time, I am assuming that Squanto had a classical education as well. Do you see the pattern? This is a part of American history. Like, it gives me goosebumps when I think about it. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Kirsten, exactly.
Dr. Prather, we got 10 minutes or so. So there looks like there's 3 open questions in the Q&A box. Maybe we answer those 3 and then,
Yes. I'm going to read this out loud. Angelique says, "It feels very overwhelming to be one of a few Black families in a classical education program, because when bringing up the limited amount of Black stories that are included in what is taught, I feel like I have to be the expert when this is all new to me too. Also, I think there was something in the book that talked about classical education being something that was historically an option for one group because of the leisure they were afforded because they had slaves. I am trying to keep my head above water to teach what is included in the program we are in, yet I do not feel confident to start something else. I am trying to reclaim my education while I teach my children, but I feel like I am running out of time to incorporate what I am learning in the Black intellectual tradition into my children's education. I'm encouraged to find out that former slaves were able to educate themselves classically. It makes me know classical education is for me and my children." There you go. Exactly. And this is something I tell Angelique, this is what I tell teachers. A lot of times when I come into a classical school for teacher training, you can feel the tension, because I think they think I'm going to come in and change their curriculum, but I'm not going to do that. I've been a teacher for many years. I would never put someone through that. Okay. what I always say is keep using your curriculum. But as you see it, bring in other voices that kind of fit in with the curriculum you're already using. Because even a little bit of mentioning, a picture on the wall, a read aloud after recess that connects to the classical tradition, but from the perspective of a person of color, will totally change the whole experience. But I also want to say this, for those of you all who are people of color, let me say this, if you're a person of color or a person teaching people of color, I want to encourage you to remove the guilt about teaching this to people of color. Number one, we've already talked about, it's a part of our heritage. The other part is this: there are so many different focused studies. I mean, I have girlfriends who are just hoping they get picked in the lottery to send their child to a French immersion public charter school. And the child is just as chocolate as they want to be. Or I've seen families try to go to Mandarin immersion schools, Spanish immersion schools, Asian, in college, you can do Latin studies, Italian Renaissance. No one says anything about that. There is absolutely nothing wrong with giving Black and brown and children of color a classical education. It's not wrong. You're not indoctrinating them into a white supremacist way of thinking. It is the education that all of our ancestors had. To know this is to know more about ourselves. And so I want to encourage you in that. The only thing I'll suggest is that as you're giving this education, wherever you can, talk about people of color who are in the story or who've connected to it. Okay. Then Emily says, I tend to travel all over the United States about twice a month, so I can travel. If you email this, my assistant will, guide you through how to get me booked. No, that's the wrong info. So if you email that and reach out to Alex, is her name, and just tell her you're interested in having me speak. I am pretty booked up until 2020, early 2023 through January. So anytime after that, if you're in town, it's a little bit easier to get me sooner. And I can also do Zoom anytime. Do I support the Haitian Revolution considering how violent it was? That's a very interesting question. I don't support slavery. I didn't support the enslavement and the lynching and the rape of innocent Black people. So what I do support is people fighting for their freedom. Now, to that end, I'm a Martin Luther King person. I'm a nonviolent activist. So you are not going to hear me promoting the work of Nat Turner and others. But I can't speak against that anymore because they were fighting literally for their own safety. You have families whose children, if you had a child, like for me, I have 3 beautiful children. If I knew someone was going to come take my children and sell them away from me, I probably would kill someone. I almost know I would. And we got to think about it like that. Like, these were human beings being mistreated in a violent, tragic way. And everyone had a different way of handling that. And so they weren't just being violent just to kill. They were like, free me. I'm tired of this oppression. I'm tired of this fear. I'm tired of this violence happening to me and my family. And so we have to understand it from that context. I hope that makes sense, Rosamond. Revolutionary suicide. That's Huey P. Newton's. So what I'm saying is the main activists that I identify with are people like Martha King, Anna Julia Cooper, Booker T. Washington to a point. And I am not personally one who celebrates violence. But what I try to encourage people to do is understand why many people responded in this way. Any other question? Thank you, Cheryl. Oh, I just missed, somebody was just. Amen, Angelique, amen.
Okay. Looks like that's all the questions that we had in. So if you happen to think of any after we log off, please feel free to reach out to us at the press or Anika, and we will be sure to be in touch. The one reminder before we go, a live recording of this webinar will be sent out to everyone who registered. That should be coming out to your emails early next week. So you have that and can share it with anyone who would like to see it. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for attending. And we will make sure to keep everyone posted with any news, updates, anything else from Dr. Prather. All right. Have a good night.
Thank you so much, everyone.